Imagine living in medieval Europe, a time when power belonged to kings, castles, and heavily armored knights. On the battlefield, these knights on horseback were considered almost unstoppable. Most people believed that no group of simple farmers could ever defeat them. But high in the rugged mountains of Switzerland, history was about to prove that belief wrong. Long before Switzerland became the peaceful country we know today, its people had a reputation for something very different: war. Even during the time of the Roman Empire, the tribes living in this region were known for their fierce fighting spirit. The Roman historian Tacitus once described the Helvetians, an ancient tribe from this region, as a people famous for their courage in battle. By the Middle Ages, the territory of modern Switzerland was technically part of the Holy Roman Empire, but the people living in these mountain valleys valued their independence. In 1291, 3 small regions, called cantons, formed an alliance known as the Swiss Confederation. It was a simple agreement between communities that promised to defend each other from outside threats. At first, the powerful Habsburg rulers of the empire tolerated this alliance, but that tolerance didn't last long. In 1315, tensions finally exploded into war. Leopold I, the Duke of Austria, decided to crush the rebellious Swiss once and for all. Confident in his power, he marched into the mountains with around 8,000 heavily armed knights and infantry soldiers. Waiting for him were only about 1,500 Swiss fighters. They weren't professional soldiers. Most of them were farmers, hunters, and villagers. They had no expensive armor and no horses, but they did have something extremely powerful: discipline, courage, and knowledge of their own land. As Leopold's army moved through a narrow mountain pass near Lake Erie, the Swiss were already waiting above them on the steep hills. Then, suddenly, the trap was sprung. Huge boulders rolled down the mountainside, crashing into the tightly packed Austrian soldiers. Before the invaders could recover, the Swiss charged downhill with long halberds and pikes, fighting in tight formations. The attack was fast, brutal, and completely unexpected. The powerful Austrian army collapsed into chaos. Many soldiers were killed, while others fled toward the lake. The Swiss pursued them relentlessly, securing a shocking victory that few in Europe could believe. That battle changed everything. The Swiss realized that heavily armored knights were not invincible. With discipline, coordination, and long weapons like pikes, infantry soldiers could stop even the most powerful cavalry charges. Over time, the Swiss refined this method of fighting. Post-some, their soldiers began carrying pikes that were nearly 18 to 20 feet long. When hundreds of men stood shoulder to shoulder holding these massive spears, they formed what became known as a pike square. To an approaching cavalry charge, it looked like a moving wall of spikes. Horses simply refused to run into it. Every Swiss canton maintained its own militia, and men trained from a young age alongside their neighbors and friends. Most of them were poor farmers, but they became incredibly disciplined fighters. They practiced marching together, turning together, and attacking together. Medieval sources even claim that Swiss soldiers could run across rough terrain while maintaining perfect formation, a skill that amazed and terrified their enemies. Their tactics proved devastating again and again. In 1339, at the Battle of Laupen, around 6,000 Swiss infantry defeated an army of 17,000 soldiers that included heavy cavalry. Once again, the Swiss pike formations proved almost impossible for mounted knights to break. The Habsburgs tried again in 1386 at the Battle of Sempach, but the result was the same. The invading army was defeated, and Duke Leopold himself was killed during the battle. By the 14th century, the reputation of Swiss soldiers had spread across Europe. Kings, emperors, and wealthy rulers began competing to hire Swiss fighters as mercenaries. These soldiers were considered some of the best infantry in the world. In fact, some commanders refused to go into battle unless they had Swiss mercenaries in their army. Their discipline, aggression, and fearless charges made them incredibly effective. One of the most famous conflicts came in the late 1400s against Charles the Bold, the powerful Duke of Burgundy. Charles commanded one of the most advanced armies in Europe, equipped with artillery, cavalry, and thousands of professional soldiers. Yet even he struggled against the Swiss. In 1476, at the Battle of Grandson, Swiss forces defeated Charles's army and captured enormous amounts of treasure and artillery. Just a few months later, at the Battle of Merton, the Swiss once again crushed Burgundy's forces, killing thousands of soldiers while suffering relatively few losses. Finally, in 1477, at the Battle of Nancy, Charles the Bold met his end. According to historical accounts, Swiss mercenaries fighting alongside Charles's enemies found him on the battlefield and killed him with a halberd strike to the head. With his death, the powerful Duchy of Burgundy collapsed. The Swiss continued proving their military strength in the Swabian War of 1499 against forces of the Holy Roman Empire. In a series of battles throughout that year, Swiss troops repeatedly defeated larger enemy armies, often using the mountainous terrain to launch surprise attacks. Sometimes they even crossed entire mountain ranges just to strike enemy forces from behind. But like all military systems, the dominance of the Swiss pikemen would not last forever. The rise of gunpowder weapons, especially firearms and artillery, began to change warfare across Europe. Pike formations that once terrified knights became increasingly vulnerable to gunfire. After suffering a major defeat at the Battle of Marignano in 1515, the era of Swiss battlefield dominance slowly began to fade. Yet their legacy never disappeared. In 1506, Pope Julius II hired 150 Swiss soldiers to serve as his personal bodyguards in Rome. He believed they were the finest soldiers in Europe and trusted them to protect the Vatican. More than 500 years later, that tradition still continues. Today, the Swiss Guard, wearing their famous colorful uniforms, still stand watch at the Vatican. A reminder that the legendary warriors of the Swiss mountains once changed the balance of power across medieval Europe.